years and years ago, I went to the cinema with my then little boy, massive boy now, to watch a Disney movie called Monsters, Inc. And the story of Monsters, Inc., I nearly fell off my seat because I was aware of this by then. It was, for people who haven't seen it, you had the monster world and then you had the human world. But the monster world did not have an energy source. It had to get its energy from the human world. So what they did, their power station in the monster world was a place where all these different, quote, monsters lined up in the morning, the workers at the factory. And doors would come down, like bedroom doors and doors you'd find in human houses. And it would lock in front of them, and then it would open. And when they walked through the door, they were in a child's bedroom or something. And their job was to frighten the child. As the child screamed in terror, the monster would grab the energy of the scream in a tube thing and go back to the monster world, and that would power the monster world. Now, I'm thinking, well, in symbolic terms, that's exactly what's happening. To absorb an energy, that energy has to be within the frequency range that you're resonating at so you can absorb it. Otherwise, it passes through and never the twain shall meet. So the entities that are manipulating this reality in their malevolent way are in a very low vibrational state. So to absorb human energy in a way that they can absorb, it has to be low vibrational energy, and that's what they do. They have set up this society to generate maximum amounts of low vibrational emotional energy, fear and all its offshoots and sub-frequencies, guilt, hatred, all these things. Stress, another one, big one. And the more stress and fear and guilt and hatred and conflict that is generated in this reality, the more of the energy within the frequency range that they can absorb and use is generated. So a war becomes a banquet, to them. Harmony generates an energy they cannot deal with because it's not on the same frequency. So they don't want harmony in this reality, they want disharmony. And that's why society is set up as it is. And these bloodlines, families that control the institutions of society, they are vehicles for creating the disharmony, which creates the energy, which empowers the manipulators, the other dimensional manipulators. So we are being vampired energetically. And in the Matrix movies, when the Morpheus character holds up a battery and says, the machines have turned humans into one of these, a battery, that was absolutely so close to the truth. We are the energy source. And their great nightmare is that we find a place of awareness that brings harmony, because then I'm afraid the electricity is switched off.
One of the wonderful tools that we have is our technology and how we're able to use it. And when we understand how technology is used, it's usually our intention, and then we create a creation from an art form. So it is an amplification of what we are. And now when we see those tools and we have the ability to use those tools, what they're allowing us to do is to see beyond spectrums that we are capable of seeing with the human eye. I've been working with light frequencies my entire life, and when we look at the entire, what we call the photonic spectrum of light, and we're looking at everything from ultraviolet all the way up to X-rays and beyond, the human eye out of this bandwidth sees this much of it. It's the color of the rainbow. So when we realize that we don't see this, and we don't see this, but it exists around us. Just ask a person, how does a cell phone work? And they explain it, but then I say, prove it. And they go, well, I can't see the frequencies that are coming from it, but there are invisible frequencies going to and fro this communications device. And we look at digital cameras, that are moving in beyond these certain spectrums, and one of the incredible mysteries of orbs that are being detected by these high quality digital cameras now. So when we start seeing how technology is aiding us and preparing us, to see beyond, then this is a big shift that happens, and we start to have the ability to accept it in such a more amazing way. We're becoming very humble in that realization, And we're digging deeper and we're finding technologies in the earth. I mean, we found in the 70s, we found the Baghdad battery, which is actually about 23 to 2,400 years old, that works on the same principles as our batteries do today. And we're told in history that we're at the highest superior time on this planet. But then how did the Egyptians understand how to create electrolum and how to gold plate? You need an electrical charge as we know it to do that. And there's a mysterious energy that happens on this planet, and that's when we understand volta or voltage, or what's called the pile, or what's called the JED through ancient history, and what we call the battery. It's a storage device that holds energy, and it's an electrochemical reaction that happens via phenomenon of the planet, and it's 1.2 volts to 1.5 volts depending on what metals we use, based on the acids or the elements when we combine. But it's a phenomenon that's a natural energy that comes from the earth. When we realize how we build batteries, we have to wire those in series to get the higher voltage that we create in that aspect. Now that's one way of harnessing energy. That's what battery does. And it'll store this energy until we pull it out of it. And so when we understand that mystery, the human system works the same way. We have a human battery, and if it starts to get oxidized, it starts to get out of balance, then it depletes. And so we can understand how when we get 50, 60 years old, most people's batteries are halfway down. And we can actually almost measure it now with our technology. But when we understand that is because of lack of awareness, because of lack of environment, lack of realization of what we truly are.
Batteries is an interesting concept because it talks to storage of energy. And I think storage of energy is a concept that we will not need to consider in long term. There's no need to collect it and store it because it is freely available. We're swimming in it. It is perpetual and it's all around us. All we need to do is tap into it as and when we need it and just draw from it what we need, when we need. End of story. It's really simple. So although battery technology is coming along, and of course hugely prominent in articles around electric cars and such technologies, but I don't think we're going to need it. I think it's a stepping stone.
And when we look at the wonderful research that Greg Braden did, and when we understand what we are, the movie The Matrix showed that to us in an amazing way, and how we look like a battery. But then when we realize 100 trillion cells in the body, and each one of those cells has 1.2 volts of electrical potential, well, you do the simple math on that. If we had the ability to convert that energy, I could power Las Vegas for 90 days just with the energy of my body. That's over 100 trillion volts of energy. So if we do that simple conversion, that's why we are understanding what the light body is, and the rainbow body, and what we're capable of once we realize what we are. Then we can turn those switches back on, all those dormant parts of the brain.
The new phase is about higher awareness, about higher and greater dimensional access, and this is achieved through the crystalline vibration. Crystals are living organisms. They are living beings. There is a sentience, there is a consciousness, there is awareness within the crystalline vibration that occurs mineralogically. These are teachers. These are examples of how that energy works. These are the amplifiers that will allow us to attune our own crystalline energies into that sacred geometric pattern, the Merkaba, the Merkiva.
On the planet now, there are aspects of potential alien technology that have been reverse engineers. We know for a fact that craft have crashed. There have been recovery of bodies and technologies, and there has been a reversal of some of those technologies. We know that beings have been met and interfaced with. But also, it's not just about having physical reversal of alien technology. We could say that people who are greatly inspired are receiving inspiration from a non-terrestrial source. I mean, what is Great Spirit? What is the divine? It's non-terrestrial by definition.
The highest evolved time on the planet Earth was the golden age of Atlantis, not Lemuria, but Atlantis, where there was incredible divine energy. He said this was from the time of 50,000 BC to about 30,000 BC, an incredible period of 20,000 years when he put it in sequence. However, he says that the golden age of Atlantis is actually from the future. It was pulled back into the past by the very Atlanteans that saw the decline and didn't want it to end that way.
Our vision for a new technological paradigm regarding energy is that everything will be available at the point of requirement, at source. So there will be no need for charging, no need for power cables. Housing, buildings won't need wiring, no infrastructure to deliver power. The new paradigm won't call for constraint, delivery, storage of power. We're going to have a new relationship with energy. And I think to some degree this will reform society in some way, because there will be a different set of economics around our very existence, our daily lives. A large part of our enslavement to the system is to pay for the power that we require just to sustain your cooking, your heating, your car, to get to work. Everything needs power. It'll be a new relationship between energy and our daily lives. And it'll be beyond delivery and storage, no longer required. Everything you have will have its own power on demand, on site.
The Atlanteans employed crystal energy. They used the technology of crystals to power their homes, to power their travels, to power everything. There was a giant Arcturian construct satellite that hovered over Atlantis and was called the second moon of Atlantis. It was surrounded by an anti-gravity field of plasma that glowed in the night like the northern lights. It was quite amazing. It could be seen all over Atlantis. It was not a natural moon. It was a purely crystalline satellite, a macrochip, if you will, 5 miles in diameter, developed by Arcturian technology, and it correlated its energies with the Poser system set on the ground. Poser systems were triangulated crystals built in pyramids that were used to power homes, power offices, power factories, power the vehicles that moved, power, to a certain degree, ley lines. The actual crystals had the ability to take light, refract it into its different colors, into its different beams, and then join them together again through a secondary crystal, and that energy was beamed Tesla style through the air and was received by a crystal placed in each home, in each vehicle, in each office, etc. Now, this was a benevolent use. The crystals could also be used to create amplified energy fields for growing of plants, for growing of food, corn, soy, for growing of trees, apple trees, fruit trees. It was also employed in factories for around workers to have that uplifting energy, that every place had an amplified energy field to give you that extra energy, to put in that extra effort. These are all benevolent causes. And the crystals that were used in the temples could receive certain celestial arcs that came through this, were amplified through the crystal satellite, through the second moon, and then sent in to the various temples, the temple of learning, the temple of rejuvenation, the temple of healing, etc. Most of these were based on the island of Poseida, which was the capital of Atlantis, the one we see with the canals built around it, dedicated to the god of the sea, Poseida.
It's arrogant to think that we're the first on this planet. This planet's been around for a very long time. We're a very, very new species. So the civilizations that have not only been here and had very advanced technologies on this planet and operated very successfully on this planet, but they have been able to apply technologies that we still cannot do, cut stones in methods that we cannot cut. And the fact that these pyramids are 30 meters underwater demonstrates to us, knowing that that has not been underwater, that area, for at least 40,000 years. It tells us very clearly, it's irrefutable, that we need to wake up to the fact that we're not alone. There's way technologies better than us, and we can advance to those technologies if we're patient, we apply ourselves, and we listen for guidance and work together toward it.
And so as the sons of Belial, the groups of Aryan became very Americanized in a sense, where they got very industrial, very profit-minded, and had all these slaves running everything that they controlled. The one thing they didn't have was the technology to run the crystalline energy. The people of the Law of One had that, and they couldn't figure out how to get that away from them. So they came up with a a very clever way of enticing the Poseidons, the Law of One, onto the negotiating table to create a federation from a confederation. They offered that they would put genetic engineering under the control of a federation if they would put the control of the crystal poser system and the satellite under federal control. The Law of One saw it as a trick. They didn't agree, and so the sons of Belial, the Aryans, came back and said, we'll give you the majority control of the panel. And so they eventually agreed with that. And the sons of Belial were very clever, and they actually made promises. There was a member of the controlling governing board of the crystalline technology that was essentially enticed, given promises of money and power, and he switched his allegiance. That gave control of the crystals to those of Arya. And as soon as that federal control came in, the population of Aryan, which by this time became very fascist, when this occurred and they did gain control of the crystal technology, they began to use the crystal technology for war. They used it to beam a thermal beam that would vaporize certain metallic strata below areas they wanted to conquer, which at that time was Greece and Turkey. And the crystals were not meant for that use. They were being overheated, they were being overrun, and the Atla-Ra were powerless to stop it, and so the crystal satellite began swerving out of control, could not be stopped, and that was the beginning of the end for Atlantis. So the crystal satellite crashed. It blew up the posers. Arion was almost completely destroyed. Poseidon was the last to go, and it was sad. People were stunned. They no longer had power. They were without the crystal energy sources. They were being forced to flee on archaic boats. The aircraft no longer worked. The ones that knew it was coming had been able to move out through the tunnel systems in advance. And they evacuated the 13 crystal skulls. They evacuated 9 of the crystals, and they evacuated some of the copper bronze plates that held the history of the world. Some were put in the Yucatan, others in Giza.
Well, the hypothesis is the Highlander, even the Celtic and the Druid stories, the Visigoth stories, that these extend back to the Anunnaki history, the Sumerian, which we think has a clearly extraterrestrial origin, and that race, the Uru, the Seraphim, the dragon race, they had an understanding of the electric field required to ignite blood, DNA. And so the ability to build structures, paramagnetic dolmen, stone circles, was the ability to make electric fields, capacitive fields, into a fractal, into a geometry that could compress charge, really defining sacred space. So we believe that that species, our ancestors, they call that raising a Shem unto the Lord, and which became our word Shem-An. And the Shem, Sitchin now says, means highward firestone, which we now know means what's called a fractal capacitor. So in the Bible they called a Shem an altar, like in a church, but actually it was the ability to build a biologic living capacitor. Because remember, when they came here, they were living to be thousands of years old, and they would get here and suddenly they begin aging catastrophically. So their equipment included this skill. It was called the Garden of Eden, and it was how to place the stones to make an electric field to reduce cellular aging. So we need to know how to concentrate life force electrically, which we believe is fractality, in order to actually define sacred space. And we think that's what they were up to.
Now what's really interesting is when we understand how is a light body achieved, or the rainbow body, what is that state that one must be in. So in the journey to become to get to the light body state, or the rainbow body, one must shed all the illusions of the self, all the dogmas. And then from there, we become aware, and then we choose consciously what will serve the people around us as well as ourselves. We usually become secondary, and we step into this level of service. Once this happens, a transformation happens within the human frequency. We start aligning ourselves. Our meridians start to align, our energy field grows even larger. And the fear energies, or the tethered frequencies, they're about 85 to 125 in what the human frequency scale. And the highest of that frequency is 1,000. And we can call that the Christ frequencies. the Buddha, the Krishna, all the higher enlightened beings that have walked on the planet. They're at this high state of vibration, and that's the reason why they're able to do amazing or miracle actions. You know, and what we perceive a miracle is something that's out of our bounds of belief, of reality, and it breaks the bounds of what we think is capable, and that becomes a miracle. So when we start creating our miracles in our own life, then we realize what we're capable of, and this potential to become the enlightened ones. We've seen artwork in history and stories in history when we see these incredible drawings where these channels of light come from the sky and bring someone into an enlightenment. And we can call that, when we call it connected to the divine, to the pure God source, when God literally shines his light on you. If you just stop looking at the light that's shining down on the one's head, look at what's happening to the people around. Most of them are usually running away because they can't handle what they're seeing. Their fears, their angers, their hatreds will destroy them in that light. It is what is inside us that would cause us to be destroyed. If we have fears, if we have angers, we have hatreds, you know, the darker part of the self is revealed, and it will rip you apart. So when we start to understand that, we must clear these paths. We must walk in a higher way of life. And that usually comes to the understanding of the true frequency of the love. You know, not the programmed love, the true frequency of love.
Part of the awakening process is humility and looking within and being connected, if you like. And as well as meditating as a group prior to an event and harmonizing our intention and polarizing our intention to whatever we're about to engage, I think it's very important as individuals to have a meditation practice and have an inward practice so that you can be in touch with your divine essence, your guidance, if you like.
There is a whole lot of spiritual science. As there is a science to create external well-being, there is a whole science to create internal well-being. So the science and technology of creating inner well-being or inner transformation is what we are referring to as inner engineering, what is being offered as inner engineering. It is not a belief system, it is not a philosophy, it is not an ideology, it's a technology of inner change. And that's what is needed in the world right now.
There's no difference between science and spirituality if they're both accurate, if they're both on. They reflect each other just like a mirror. And so once that was understood a long time ago, then science took on a different role. It wasn't a role of just how to figure out how to do things better, but it was connected to pure consciousness.
And one of the things that fascinates me is the convergence of science and spirituality, and this notion, this concept that we are one with everything around us is so much more true than anybody ever imagined. The physics is now starting to show that from an atomic perspective, we are oneness, we have conscious connection with that creation process. The whole concept of co-creation is more real than we've ever been able to show before. As the technology evolves, we evolve individually, and the two have to go hand in hand. There has to be harmony and progress equally between us individual, collectively, on all levels, sociological, economic levels, as well as technology. We can't have technology shooting ahead and then dominating our evolutionary processes.
Quartz has the ability to change us. Quartz has the ability to amplify us. Quartz has the ability to help us reach our divine mind source because it is crystalline in nature. The universe, the divinity, God is within sacred geometry, is within crystalline consciousness, is within the quantum crystalline field. These are examples of perfect inorganic mineralization of the crystalline field. A sequence of pyramid-shaped atoms of silicon and oxygen look like perfect pyramids in perfect order. And when we have our mind reach that perfect order, that way of walking our talk, that way of feeling none of the negative vibrations such as fear, worry, anxiety, and guilt. When we feel love, which is a frequency, love is a language, love is a code, coded on light, and it is carried by the crystalline vibration. When we reach the level that we can feel that and we can merge our own consciousness into the impeccability of the crystalline field, our own energy fields, our own electromagnetic auras into the 8-pointed star of the Merkaba, and the 8-pointed star of the Merkaba into the 12-pointed star of the Makiva. Then we are in the crystalline vibration. Then we are working within the 2012 ascension within the 144 double pentadodecahedron crystalline field.
The convergence of science and spirituality is really the pinnacle of where we can evolve to if they are in harmony with each other. And we hold respect for nature. She is everything. She holds all the secrets. If we watch and listen and learn and replicate, she'll help us. And that includes information coming through Great Spirit, teaching us as we go along.
As we ascend to a higher level of consciousness, spirituality and intelligence, we will recognize that gold is not about money, but it is about the divine white light, the greatest energy field of all. DNA has the white light in it, and what we have to manifest is we have to increase the white light, the light body in our DNA, decrease the physical body, increase our light body, and function as a superconductor, and then viruses are not going to destroy this earth and all its life.
And then to move into the rainbow body. But we have to understand the rainbow body kind of takes us into what, connecting the dots of what we're calling the ascended path, the path to ascension, where all this energy is converted, and there's something that happens within the soul energy. But then the human body has the ability to transform itself, literally turn those switches on. And when I started doing a little bit of research about the Shroud of Turin, the image on it itself, when we realize, and we can compare it to what a copy machine does, where an incredible intense light source uses carbon, and with that light source has the ability to attract positively, either the element, which is the toner cartridge, but then what it does, it grabs on. But one of the key things is to realize how that light burst works, that the original Xerox machines, an incredible light source, and it would literally look like a copy, almost someone putting their face on a scanner and scanning it that way. It's almost that amount of energy that went through the shroud itself.
So when we want to look at the greatness of Jesus, which is always fascinating, and the Bible reiterates very heavy on one particular subject, and that was why when people touched Jesus' garments, they were healed. And many people don't understand why they were healed. And statements that were made that were fascinating, one that fascinated me deeply was when the disciples asked Jesus at the Last Supper, "How will we be able to see you again?" Because he had told them, of course, he was leaving. And he answered them, when you wear your right garments and have made your right food. And of course, that doesn't have anything to do with how you weave your clothes or the type of food you're cooking, but it has to do with the monoatomic gold, the platinum group elements, and the fact that when you wear that, you are able to radiate a Meissner field. And with this ability to radiate this divine healing energy, people are healed. Anything is healed that you touch or put that energy on. So that's been going on for a long, long time.
So when we start to connect the dots within our technology and realization of what it would take to do that, we can start understanding this in a much bigger picture. And we start putting ourselves into energy vortexes, like the stupas. They were huge accumulators of energy. They're done with gold, and they look like a Tesla coil when we look at it from a technical aspect. Tesla coil has the ability to harness incredible amounts of energy, take a low voltage and increases it to a high voltage. And we realize that's a standard rules within nature.
The quantum vacuum is all pervasive. It's like the water to a fish. We don't know it's here, but the energy, we're swimming in that energy. All matter, everything you can touch and perceive, is a condensation of energy into matter. And what that means, for example, if you have two tuning forks that are tuned the same and you smash one or tap one, hit one, the other one will start to vibrate in sympathetic resonance. Well, on the one side we've got the quantum vacuum that has fluctuations. It's measurable. We know it's there, and we know it's very dense and very, very powerful. It's so powerful, in fact, that per square centimetre, say your little fingernail, would be enough to power probably your whole house if you could tap into the energy density of that size. Of course, drawing power from the quantum vacuum means it'll work in space. It'll work on Mars. This technology will last for our foreseeable future in all kinds of applications, both terrestrial and non-terrestrial, which is also very exciting because there's not many inventions and innovations in the power domain that you can say that about, really.
Crystalline substances such as quartz, especially quartz, emit an electromagnetic field. These are tremendous receivers, tremendous transmitters. We would not be talking here, you would not be using that camera, that digital camera, if it were not for silicon quartz technology. You would not have a laptop to download that onto. You would not have a telephone that would ring. You would not have a watch that would work. That is the piezoelectric quality of quartz, the ability of quartz to emit a very, very synchronized electronic pulse. And these are living consciousness. Consciousness occurs within the crystalline vibration.
At the moment, there's a lot of places on the planet that are suffering due to lack of water facility and clean water. We have some technologies available now, which we are starting to commercialize and make available, which can generate clean, pure water, even enhanced water with high levels of oxygen. And we can take seawater, we can take water from the atmosphere, and once we've got the power to run those, which is the biggest overhead, then that water becomes plentiful and practically free, because the power to run it is free.
Essentially, we can draw water from the air, it's there. We can draw electricity from the air, it's there. We don't need to power generators to do these things that burn up oil, fuel, those things which are the very bones and existence and roots of our Mother Earth. It's kind of like we just sell them off to the highest bidder. It's, again, old paradigm stuff.
Just like Dr. Emoto discovered that intent can fashion the appearance, fashion the shape of water, the same thing can occur with quartz. The quartz is in a sense a amplified silicon-based water, that our impressions, our intents, the way we work with these is that our own electrical magnetic field can be amplified by the emissions of crystalline quartz. And therefore our intent, our auric field are in a state where we can manifest, where we can heal, where we can go deeper into our own consciousness and achieve the crystalline vibration.
We do know that our vibration, our energy that we put out, is picked up by water. We can see it in the geometrical format and response of the crystalline structure of water as it freezes into a pattern. We can see it in the development of viruses and so on in different water samples. We can guide energy and thought and emotion into water. And water is just so beautiful and unique to us. We're made of it, the planet's made of it. It's that source material of life. And the other source material, of course, is energy. And since water responds to our thought and our emotive force, I believe we can also guide that into matter, and we can use an energetic format, a blueprint, if you like, guided by consciousness. Water gives us the example. It shows us that this technology exists, and it's there for us to learn and adopt and potentially enhance our being.
I live by the medicine wheel, completely. I think that the story of viruses, and this is my work, I'm very concerned about viruses. I mean, viruses are so powerful, they survived the nuclear bomb, hydrogen bomb, they survive it, totally. And what we have to do is we have to learn how to live with them. And that's not easy. And I think the thing that makes us most vulnerable with viruses, of course, we all know the story of antibiotics. We are over antibiotic. And of course, resistance has developed to particular microorganisms, especially methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, which is now out of control. But we also have to examine the negativities we're trying to survive under. We're chemicalized beings, we're radiated beings. And these are all things that the virus is like. How do we rise above it? I believe that the only way we are going to control the viruses itself is through a higher level of consciousness and spirituality. Well, sound is everything. From the beginning forward, it's the harmonics that allowed us to be created just as well as it is light. This is basically what my formulas are all about. Every single formula. The one we are doing right now was blessed at noontime and injected with 528 harmonic frequencies of divine unconditional love, amongst other frequencies that I use. The frequencies are all based on healing frequencies, on disease prevention, on joy and happiness, manifesting love.
You know, there's obviously bad electromagnetic stuff, microwaves, all this stuff flying through the air that gives us cancer or whatnot. And then there are the healing side of it as well. And these are the innate frequencies that our bodies and our cells vibrate at, that the earth vibrates at, that many people have been tuned in for a long time. Tesla, Lukovsky, these kinds of guys that have been squashed, right? But I think as the acceptance of this, or remembrance and a reapplication of that technology starts happening, you're going to see a lot more application of it. So, but this is what cracks me up, right? We don't even know why magnets work. We harness them, we turn them into motors, we drive them around, but we actually don't know what the exact physical properties are that make up that magnet and those properties that it has. Same thing with fire. We harness fire, but we can't actually define why a candle burns at that height in that exact pattern and thermal color, etc., etc. But we harness it. So it's really going to be doors wide open when we start to have access to same elements, same things that are here. We're not getting off this planet, not in mass for a long time, but I think it's the same thing of dimension.
Because if you see something beautiful that you know you were gifted from our Creator, and you don't act on that, why on earth would you want to be here? That is your gift to share. It is then your responsibility to make the rest of your life about how to share that. And I think as we move closer towards these next few years, the ongoing years, the shifts and changes that we're in the midst of, the ability to share those and bring those through are going to become easier and easier for those that align themselves with the shift.
So as we become more capable, we are also supposed to become more sensible, which is yet to happen. We have become extremely capable because of technology, but we have not become accordingly sensible. We just have to come to our senses.
Part of the responsibility of bringing these technologies to the public domain is to shepherd it in a way that it becomes available to everyone. And part of that process, of course, part of the traditional process is to patent something so that you can protect it. And another issue that comes up with, and is very popular, is open sourcing the technology. The problem with that, as we perceive it, is that it can be manipulated, transformed, bastardized in some way. And I think the responsibility of the initiators is to guide it so that the integrity of the technology and its delivery is maintained. And if you make it open source, you have no control of that. But it's not a control issue, it's really a responsibility issue. It's interesting how spirit moves through people who can make things move these days. We've had offers of investment from billionaires who have made an awful lot of money very recently, and they've had this calling to want to do some good with it. And I think a lot of funding, a lot of projects in the future will have heartfelt, heart-oriented funding, because this is what Great Spirit, if you like, this is what's required by the human species at this time. All you need to do is take the first step. If you can't quite see it all, don't be afraid to start. You've just got to move where your heart takes you in the right direction. Ask for guidance, ask for support, and the top of the mountain will become visible when it's due to be visible. But just make sure you start taking those steps towards it. So I'm excited to see us move forward hand in hand with technology to support us in an ethical and ecological manner, to be able to bring out those qualities, incredible qualities of the human potential, that we can have a better, more harmonious relationship with the very fabric of nature. And this allows us from a human's perspective to turn into that star-seeking race, star-traveling race, that I think is inevitable for us. The planet's going to run out at some time of resources. We might run out of space. We might get hit by a cataclysm. Who knows what the future holds for us? And I guess once our needs as a society are taken care of, and profit becomes a concept of the past, and we move away from that, I'd like to think that the human spirit will evolve into something more creative and more potential fulfilling than it is now. Because we are slaves in a system. We're bound to processes just to survive and be comfortable and provide for our kids. And in the future I see, and it sounds very utopian, and why not? Because the future is what we make of it. So let's make it utopian. That's our choice. So let it be that we have free resources. I believe it can be done. Let's believe and make sure that there is the environment for us to blossom and flower as human individuals and live and share this planet from a heart space and not from a need space.